At 3 in the morning on February 2nd, 1502, a sound rose through the marble halls of Ferrara's Este castle. It was neither a scream nor a cry of joy. It was something else, something unnameable, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of kingdoms. The torches along the corridors flickered as if stirred by an unseen wind. Guards stiffened. Courtiers glanced at one another in uneasy silence. Every man and woman in those candlelit halls knew what the sound meant, yet none dared to speak it aloud. Behind a pair of carved oak doors, history was unfolding in the most unsettling way imaginable. That night, Lucrezia Borgia, daughter of Pope Alexander VI, was fulfilling her duty to the House of Este. Her marriage to Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duchy of Ferrara, was no simple union of hearts. It was a contract written in flesh, a ritual that fused politics, faith, and performance into one act. For the Borgias, this alliance meant power. For the Estes, it meant papal favor and gold enough to build an empire. But for Lucrezia, it meant survival. The night was heavy with superstition. Outside the castle, the moon hung low and red above the frozen Po River, its reflection rippling like spilled wine. Inside, the corridors glowed with candlelight and whispered prayers. February 2nd was the feast of the purification of the Virgin, a holy day of cleansing and renewal. It was a date chosen not by accident, but by design, for in the mind of the Renaissance, purity and sin often shared the same breath. The chamber prepared for the young bride resembled a stage more than a bridal room. The bed stood like an altar, its silken canopy drawn in deep crimson, its posts carved with angels whose faces watched in eternal silence. Perfumed smoke coiled upward from brass braziers, filling the air with a sweetness that could not disguise the tension underneath. Outside the chamber doors waited courtiers and witnesses, appointed to confirm that the marriage had been fulfilled. In this age, even the most private act was treated as statecraft. Lucrezia entered the room as if stepping into judgment. Her gown was white silk, embroidered with gold thread, the fabric whispering against the stone floor. Around her neck, a chain of fine gold glimmered, a gift from her father, a reminder that the power of Rome itself lay behind her. Her hands trembled, though not from fear. She had known fear before. What filled her now was something colder, sharper, like the moment before a blade falls. Alfonso d'Este stood waiting beside the bed, his expression calm, almost unreadable. He was a man of war, an engineer and soldier whose strength had been forged in sieges and smoke. Yet tonight his courage was to be measured not on the battlefield, but here, in this silent chamber, under the gaze of invisible witnesses. He knew what was expected. His performance would secure his dynasty, his city, and his pride. Failure would mean humiliation, not just for him, but for Ferrara itself. When the final prayers were whispered and the doors closed, the castle seemed to exhale. Outside, the guards resumed their posts. The diplomats shifted uncomfortably, their ears straining for sounds that would confirm what had taken place beyond the curtain. They knew the ritual was sacred. They also knew it was scandalous, for in Renaissance Italy, the consummation of a marriage was not an act of love. It was a political ceremony. It had to be witnessed, verified, and if possible, repeated. Lucrezia understood this far better than anyone. She had lived her entire life beneath the eyes of men who saw her not as a woman, but as a vessel for alliances. she had been used as a token of peace, a symbol of promise, and a scapegoat for corruption. Twice she had entered marriage. Twice she had emerged branded by scandal. This time would be different. This time, she would not be the pawn. She would be the player. As the first candle burned low, the ritual began. The silence of the castle deepened, and outside the chamber, a court scribe waited with quill and parchment. He would record nothing of intimacy, only the fact that it had been fulfilled. It was proof, legal and binding. To the Este family, it meant security. To the Borgias, it meant victory. To Lucrezia, it meant freedom of a kind that only power could grant. In the early hours before dawn, whispers drifted down the corridor. The first act had been completed. Somewhere in the shadows, the court witnesses nodded to one another. The marriage was legitimate. The alliance was sealed. But even as confirmation spread through the castle, the ritual was not yet finished. For in Ferrara, once was never enough. Whispers of annulment, impotence, and betrayal had ruined too many noble houses. Rumor was poison in Renaissance Italy, and only absolute proof could counter it. The Este family, cautious and shrewd, had decreed that the union must be proven beyond any doubt. The ritual would be repeated, not once more, but twice. And so, the night deepened, the candles burned shorter, the air grew thick with heat and incense. Those stationed outside the chamber exchanged uneasy glances as faint echoes reached them through the walls. It was not the sound itself that unsettled them, but what it represented, the transformation of intimacy into ceremony, of privacy into performance. To the men who would later write of this night, it was both obscene and awe-inspiring. To the women of Ferrara, it was a story whispered in disbelief. To Lucrezia, it was endurance. She was no longer the frightened girl who had entered her first marriage as her father's pawn. She was a woman forged in fire, who had survived betrayal, imprisonment, and grief. Each breath she took that night was an act of defiance. Each moment was a declaration that she understood the game better than any man who had written the rules. When the second ritual concluded, the castle seemed to fall into a strange, reverent silence. Outside the chamber, the air was thick with expectation. Even the wind through the corridors seemed to hesitate. But within the Este family's inner circle, unease remained. Two consummations were not enough to silence the tongues of Rome or Venice or Milan. Every whisper could become a weapon. Every rumor could start a war. There would be a third. The decision came quietly, delivered by a chancellor whose face betrayed neither hesitation nor emotion. The order was law. Before dawn, the act would be repeated a final time, and so it was that the fate of two dynasties came to rest on one final ritual beneath the crimson canopy. Outside, the first light of dawn began to touch the windows, pale and cold. In the corridors, guards shifted as if awakening from a spell. Somewhere deep within the castle, a scribe folded his parchment and sealed it with wax, marking the moment as official. The alliance between Rome and Ferrara was complete, but the cost was something no record could measure. In that room, amid the fading candles and the scent of extinguished flame, a young woman had turned survival into power. The ritual that should have reduced her to a symbol had made her something far more dangerous. For Lucrezia Borgia had learned the ultimate secret of her age, that the appearance of purity could conceal the sharpest form of control. When the doors finally opened and the witnesses were dismissed. No one spoke. The servants bowed low. The ambassadors kept their eyes to the floor. The night had ended, yet its echoes would ripple through history. For in those dark hours, the bed had become a battlefield, the bride had become a weapon, and the whispers that began in Ferrara would soon travel through every court in Europe. And as the first bell of morning rang through the city, one truth became clear. This was not the end of Lucrezia's story. It was only the beginning. The first candle had burned away, but two remained, and before the sun rose, both would flicker again, carrying with them a power no one could ever fully control. The morning after Lucrezia Borgia's wedding was unlike any other morning in Ferrara. The light that spilled through the high arched windows of the Este Palace was pale and hesitant, as if even the sun was reluctant to touch the aftermath of what had occurred in the ducal bedchamber. The heavy scent of incense still lingered in the corridors, mingling with rose petals left from the night before. Every servant who passed that door lowered their eyes and whispered prayers. The bride and groom had fulfilled their duty. The city would speak of nothing else for days. Lucrezia sat before a tall mirror framed in gold leaf, her reflection ghostly in the dim light. The silk sheets had already been removed, folded, and carried away under the watchful eyes of noble women who would confirm to the court that the marriage had been consummated. It was a ritual older than memory itself, proof of purity, proof of obedience, proof that the alliance between Ferrara and Rome had been sealed not by faith, but by flesh. Her maid, Caterina, moved behind her silently, combing Lucrezia's long, golden hair. The young woman's hands trembled slightly, afraid to look up. Finally, she whispered, "My lady, the court waits for you. Shall I tell them you are ready?" Lucrezia's reflection did not move. For a long moment, she stared at her own face, pale as ivory, and at the faint bruises that the night had left like signatures of power. "Yes," she said at last, "let them see what they have made of me." Outside, the bells of San Giorgio began to toll. In the great hall below, the Duke's courtiers gathered in their finest silks, whispering about the night's events. The sound of trumpets echoed as Alfonso d'Este appeared at the far end of the chamber. His expression was calm, almost proud, though fatigue shadowed his eyes. When Lucrezia entered, every voice fell silent. She moved with a grace that silenced even envy, her white gown trailing like mist across the marble floor. The ambassadors rose to honor her, bowing deeply. The papal envoys smiled, satisfied. One of them, an old man with eyes sharp as glass, leaned to another and murmured, "The Borgias never failed to deliver." Their laughter was low, careful, the laughter of men who knew how easily power turned to peril. Lucrezia smiled for them, but only with her lips. Inside, she felt hollow. The night had not been an act of love. It had been a performance, repeated 3 times before witnesses who stood outside the door, waiting to record the proof. 3 times because tradition demanded it. 3 times because men believed that repetition could transform ritual into certainty. But nothing could wash away the truth that she had learned long ago. In her world, a woman's body was a contract signed in silence. When the celebration began again that morning, Lucrezia excused herself and walked to the small chapel adjoining her chambers. The corridors were lined with tapestries depicting saints and martyrs. Their painted eyes seemed to follow her as she passed. The chapel was cold and dim, its air thick with the scent of extinguished candles. She knelt before the altar and closed her eyes. For a long time, she did not pray, she only breathed. Then she whispered, "If I am to be their pawn, give me the mind to outlive them all." That morning, something within her changed. She had been taught that obedience was survival, that beauty was her armor, and silence her weapon. But as she knelt in that frozen chapel, she realized that silence could also be power. Over the following days, the wedding festivities continued. Musicians played in the courtyards. Poets recited verses comparing Lucrezia to Venus herself. Painters began sketches of her face to send to Rome as proof of the Este family's good fortune. Yet behind every compliment was suspicion. The Borgias were too powerful, too cunning, too feared. In Ferrara, Lucrezia was not welcomed as a bride, but studied as a threat. "She smiles like an angel," whispered one lady to another, "but they say her father killed for less." "And her brother," came the reply, "he kills for pleasure." Lucrezia heard the whispers. She did not silence them. Instead, she let them grow. She had learned that fear could be as useful as loyalty. When people feared you, they spoke your name with caution, and that caution was its own kind of respect. Each morning, she attended Mass beside Alfonso, her face a perfect mask of devotion. Each evening, she hosted banquets, her laughter soft, but never careless. Behind closed doors, she studied letters, learned Ferrara's politics, and wrote to Rome in secret code. In her father's eyes, she was a bridge between two worlds. In truth, she was learning how to build her own. Weeks passed. The memories of her wedding night lingered like smoke, but she buried them beneath the rhythm of her new life. Alfonso proved a capable but distant husband. He was a man of the forge and battlefield, more comfortable among weapons than words. Yet even he began to notice the quiet strength that radiated from her. She never contradicted him publicly, never raised her voice, but her opinions began to echo through the court. Decisions were made in her favor without anyone realizing who had suggested them. By the end of the year, Ferrara's nobles spoke of her with reluctant admiration. "She has the patience of a saint," they said, "and the mind of a general." It was not entirely untrue, but at night, when the halls grew quiet and the fires burned low, Lucrezia would sit by the window of her chamber and stare into the darkness. The moon over Ferrara looked different from the one in Rome, colder somehow. She would remember the man she had lost, Alfonso of Aragon, strangled in the Vatican by unseen hands, and wonder if the ghosts of the past ever truly left. Sometimes she dreamed of him. In her dreams, he walked beside her in the gardens of Ferrara, silent but smiling. When she reached for him, he always vanished, leaving only the sound of bells and the faint taste of blood in the air. Years passed, and the world began to change around her. Her father, Pope Alexander VI, died. Her brother Cesare, once the terror of Italy, fell from power. Rome turned its eyes elsewhere. Yet Lucrezia endured. She had learned how to survive storms by standing perfectly still, while others were swept away. Ferrara slowly became her realm. She founded libraries, supported poets and scholars, and turned the court into one of Italy's brightest centers of art. Even her enemies began to admit that the Borgia name, once synonymous with scandal, had found grace in her hands. The Duchess who had been whispered about became a patroness of beauty and faith. But history never forgets its shadows. Some nights, Lucrezia would still wake to the echo of that first wedding night, the sound of doors closing, the murmured prayers of witnesses, the rustle of parchment recording her fate. It would take her years to understand that the same night which had humiliated her had also set her free, because from that night onward, she owed nothing to anyone. She had already given the world everything it demanded. When Alfonso grew older and his temper softened, they found a kind of peace between them. It was not love in the way poets described it, but a quiet companionship born of endurance. They would dine together in silence, and sometimes, when their hands brushed, neither would pull away. It was as if, after decades of playing their parts, they finally recognized each other as human. Lucrezia gave birth to several children, each greeted by Ferrara with celebration. She would hold them close, study their faces, and wonder what kind of world they would inherit. She wanted them to grow in a world where their worth was not measured in alliances or proof, but in wisdom and strength. In the final years of her life, Lucrezia became more withdrawn. She spent hours in the chapel, her head bowed over her rosary. Servants said that sometimes she spoke softly while praying, as if answering questions no one else could hear. Perhaps she was speaking to ghosts. In the spring of 1519, as the first storms rolled over Ferrara, she gave birth again. The child did not survive. Fever followed, swift and merciless. As thunder shook the palace, Alfonso sat beside her bed, holding her hand. Her breathing grew faint, her eyes half closed. He whispered her name, perhaps for the first time, with genuine tenderness. "I was never your enemy," he said. She looked at him then, and for a moment the years fell away. "No," she whispered, "but you were never free either." Those were her last words. Outside, lightning struck the cathedral spire, splitting the cross in two. The river overflowed its banks, flooding the streets. The people of Ferrara said it was a sign that even heaven wept for her. Lucrezia Borgia was buried in the convent of Corpus Domini, dressed in white, her hands folded over a rosary. No great monument was built for her, no golden inscription, only a small plaque bearing her name. Yet for centuries afterward, poets, historians, and painters would try to capture her, some as a saint, some as a sinner, most as both. The truth, perhaps, was simpler. She had been born into a world where power demanded obedience and obedience demanded sacrifice, but she had turned both into art. They said her wedding had been consummated 3 times in one night. Perhaps it had, but the real consummation was not of flesh, it was of destiny. That night, Lucrezia Borgia ceased to be a daughter, a bride, or a pawn. She became something far more enduring, a woman who learned to survive history by mastering its silence. And long after the candles burned out, her story kept burning in the shadows, refusing to die.